Hello and welcome back to Ancient and Medieval Worlds. This is lecture 17 on Roman crisis, or really around the crisis of the 3rd century and how it was eventually resolved. Well, we've been looking now at the Roman Empire at its peak under the early emperors, more than 200 years of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and the magnificent structures the Romans built to expand their civilization across the Mediterranean world and further north into Europe than urban civilization had ever gone before. And we've looked at the vast amounts of trade that were going on with the wider empires, all the way stretching to China, and the economic prosperity of this early Roman Empire. Today we're going to talk about a series of crises that shook the Roman world, collectively called the 3rd century crisis by modern historians. What's actually amazing is that despite this period of nearly 50 years of chaos, the Roman Empire survived, albeit in a dramatically altered form. And that was by no means assured, and in fact the Han Dynasty in China collapsed at almost exactly the same time period. This is not the fall of Rome, but it's a necessary part of the story of how parts of Rome would eventually fall, and to understand the elements of Rome that did survive into the Middle Ages, because this was no longer going to be the Rome of Marcus Aurelius, an enlightened princeps or first citizen of the Rome on the model of Augustus, still looking back to the era of the Republic and its elected civic institutions. The emperors who survived the crisis of the 3rd century were no longer called princeps, but dominus, lord, a term in Roman society that designated a master of slaves, not a magistrate governing free citizens. The dominate, as it is often now called by historians, became the model of rule that would fight a long defeat against barbarian invaders with still famous names like Vandals, Goths, and Huns, and that would be remembered in the Middle Ages, that would continue in the eastern half of the empire, and that would oversee the triumph of Christianity in the Mediterranean world. Now, I did mention in our lecture on the Roman emperors under the Principate, another dynasty that replaced the Antonines or adoptive emperors after the assassination of Marcus Aurelius's incompetent son Commodus. Now, the name of the Severan dynasty does not particularly matter for our course, but it's possible even to see the transition to the emperors of the Dominate beginning in the era of the Severan dynasty. I do say this with some sense of longing, because actually I think the Severan dynasty is perhaps the most fascinating dynasty of the Roman emperors, but we don't unfortunately have time to linger on them. The civil wars after Commodus's death were longer than the brief year of the 4 emperors that followed Nero, and the following Severan dynasty was more militaristic. This was where I got that cynical quote in the previous lecture for the emperor's relationship to the military. Love each other, pay the troops, and despise the rest. The dying words of the first Severan emperors to his 2 sons. They at least caught the pay the troops and despise the rest. Love each other was something the Severans had a real problem with. Well, despite this focus on the soldiers, the final member of the Severan dynasty was actually killed by his own troops for trying to buy off some Germans rather than fight them. Such an action made him look militarily weak and cowardly. This was not really the fault of the emperor. Rome was facing much greater external threats than it had in the era of the Pax Romana. From the north, along the borders of the Rhine and Danube rivers, the Germanic tribes had been profoundly influenced by their contact with Rome, as we have already begun to see in our previous lecture on Celts and Germans. Trade across the border had continued, and with it went ideas about leadership and political organization. 2 centuries earlier, Arminius had been assassinated by his fellow tribesmen for acting too much like an emperor. But by the early 200s CE, the Germanic tribes were forming enormous coalitions, super tribes made up of many different tribes, slowly forming wider ethnic identities on a much larger scale than in the time of Caesar or Augustus, although these were constantly in flux across the several hundred years that we'll be looking at in the next few lectures. The most famous of these were the Goths, who attacked the Roman Empire repeatedly across the Danube during the 3rd century crisis, eventually penetrating so deeply that they sacked Athens in the heart of Greece. The Goths would continue to be a problem to the end of the empire, although they continually evolved and changed over the course of several centuries. Goth was always a loose and malleable identity that several different barbarian groups would identify with. There were other major coalitions whose identities were also in their infancy at this time, but still caused major damage to the western part of the empire, such as the Franks, who began pillaging Gaul during the 3rd century crisis. Well, despite the fact that these barbarians get all the credit, the East may have actually been the bigger danger for Rome during the 3rd century crisis, because the border in Mesopotamia faced a resurgent Persian Empire. Now, again, I already talked about this when I talked about empires, the other empires at the same time as the Roman Principate, but largely this was to a very large degree, a problem that had been brought on by the Romans themselves. That old Parthian dynasty that had dominated the region of Persia and Mesopotamia and into Central Asia since the failure of the old Hellenistic Seleucid kings had now itself collapsed, in part because of wars with the Severan dynasty. And they had been replaced by, unfortunately for the Romans, a much more successful and aggressive new dynasty to rule over Persia, which combined with the Germanic tribes that we've already looked at, was a serious problem. This new Sassanid dynasty was vastly more aggressive and effective. The Parthians had mostly been invaded by Romans. There were only a couple of occasions where they actually invaded Roman territory. Under Sassanid rule, the situation reversed. The Sassanid Persian Empire started aggressively invading the Roman Empire because they were trying to recreate the great Achaemenid dynasty brought down by Alexander 500 years earlier. The Parthians had really much more culturally in common with the other Hellenistic rulers that the Romans had eventually killed off. The Sassanids very deliberately attempted to recall the empire of the First Persian Empire of Cyrus the Great, Darius, and Xerxes, and they had a very aggressive idea of trying to reclaim all of that territory, which of course would have meant taking most of the eastern half of the Roman Empire. So there was a combination of outside threats coming across all three major boundaries of the Roman Empire. The coalitions of German tribes over both the Rhine and Danube frontiers, these great rivers that loosely defined the border of the Roman Empire in the north, and the new Sassanid Persians coming from the east. Now, added to this, a Roman dynasty had just come to an end with the death of the last of the Severans in 235, and there was no obvious candidate to replace him. In the two previous brief civil wars during the era of Pax Romana, the same three army commands along the Rhine, Danube, and in the east had fought it out. The problem was that this time, in 235, nobody was able to quickly gain the upper hand. Well, to put it another way, in the 265 years between the rise of Augustus and the death of the last Severan emperor, there had been 24 legitimate emperors and 15 rebellious claimants, almost all during the two brief civil wars. You can see all of these before the red line on this chart of Roman emperors from Augustus down to Diocletian, who we'll be covering in a moment. Well, in the 50 years of the 3rd century crisis, which is the remaining almost half of the emperors you see pictured here, there were 21 legitimate emperors and 38 rebellious claimants, as well as 11 rulers of breakaway states, which I'll get to in a moment. You can see the numbers done up here in the 50-year chunks of the crises. And you can see that the crisis became even worse as time went on. No one could really effectively manage to establish the prestige and legitimacy necessary to found a lasting dynasty of emperors in this era in Roman history. These emperors, by the way, are only called legitimate because the Senate voted to legitimize them, but that's really nothing but a historical nicety. The truth that the armies were in control was no longer a politely concealed lie, as it had vaguely been during the era of the Pax Romana, that is, of the Principate. Many of these emperors only ruled for a matter of a few years or even months before being killed in battle or betrayed by their own troops so as to avoid being on the losing side of a battle. As you can imagine, all these civil wars between rival emperors and would-be emperors took a huge toll on the Roman army at exactly the time that increased foreign threats from the Germanic confederations and the rising Sassanid Persians were likewise putting pressure on military resources from without. It was difficult to replace troops at the staggering rate that they were dying in both civil and defensive wars. Moreover, These constant civil wars and turnover from emperor to emperor meant having to increase army pay, effectively bribing the soldiers to accept and support their claims over other candidates, bidding for armies effectively. But the only way that the Roman economy, which was quite primitive by our standards, could handle this was to increase taxes and mint more coins with less actual silver in them. And you can actually see this in the decline of the Antoninianus, one of the chief Roman coins used to pay soldiers. The silver content goes down, and you see it physically becomes less shiny as it eventually decreases to be less than 5% silver by the 270s at the height of the crisis. Well, this made everyone mad, not just the soldiers, because the coins were effectively worthless, and you see vast currency inflation, which of course only encouraged the debasement of the currency yet further by Roman emperors in order to produce even more coins, which caused more inflation. It was a positive feedback loop, a snowball effect, both in economic and in military terms. Disaster fed on disaster. Well, the first few decades of these many briefly ruling emperors, the candidates for becoming an emperor continued to come from the traditional elites in the Senate. Now, certainly they could not trace their ancestry all the way back to the families of the late Republic, but that was nothing new. They at least came from the imperial court in Rome, and they had an air of legitimacy for it. They were wealthy and well-connected, and they respected the ancient institutions of the Roman aristocracy. An example is the Emperor Philip the Arab, who ruled from 244 to 249 CE. Philip's brother was a highly placed member of the Roman military, and Philip himself was married to the daughter of a Roman provincial governor. So he was absolutely a member of Rome's political elite. Now, note his Greek name. Philip was came from a Hellenized, Romanized family. He was himself a provincial. He's clearly descended from Arabs, but he is a fully Romanized, a Greco-Romanized Arab. Philip was completely Romanized in attitude. He was actually rather dismissive of non-Romanized Arabs, commenting that the border with Arabia, which was not particularly a concern or a crisis, could be made more safe by simply importing a few more lions into the desert. And this dismissive attitude for the Arabs who lived in the Arabian Peninsula continued until the birth of Islam, as we shall see in many lectures to come. Well, Philip became emperor when his predecessor was killed in battle with the Sassanid Persian Empire. It's possible that Philip had actually helped this along. Our sources for this era are extremely poor. Philip immediately made peace with the Persians and returned to Rome, where he celebrated the 1000th anniversary of the city's founding. Philip tried to do everything right. He appealed to the Senate for his authority. He appointed his son co-emperor in hopes of founding a dynasty. But he was faced with further wars with Persia and invasions by Germanic tribes, including the Goths. Under this pressure, his armies began rebelling. And this was pretty normal. That's why I'm using Philip as an example. If there's anything unusual about Philip, it's that he's actually managed to pull this off for almost 5 years. The first rebellion happened along the Danube, where the local army proclaimed their local commander the new emperor, a rival to Philip. Well, Philip sent an army to go suppress this revolt, although he didn't go with it himself. And that was a mistake because that army won. They defeated the initial rebels on the Danube, but they then proclaimed their emperor, their commander, to be the new emperor. Philip, of course, now actually had to leave with whatever forces he could get together. He had to meet this new usurper in battle, this traitor to his cause, and he was either killed during the fighting or by his own troops, along with his 11-year-old son that he had made his co-emperor. He had reigned for just a little over 5 years. So the crisis of the Roman Empire was really acute by the time we reached the reign of Philip the Arab, who notably was the ruler over Rome at the 1000th anniversary of its founding, if you take the mythical founding date that the Romans gave themselves. In the next part of this lecture, we'll look to see the lowest point during the Roman crisis and how this was eventually solved by Diocletian and his innovative, if ultimately unsuccessful, tetrarchy government.